A struggling single dad and his son open their hearts and home to an elderly woman, rekindling lost family bonds and finding unexpected love. Amid quiet kindness and gentle healing, they discover that home is where love and second chances grow. If you're moved by stories of kindness and new beginnings, subscribe for more heartfelt journeys like this. The wind carried the hush of evening down the quiet street, brushing past tire fences and rustling dry leaves that hadn't been swept in days. A street lamp flickered like an old heartbeat, steady but faint. Beneath its glow stood a man and a boy, shadows softened by weariness and warmth. And just beyond them, on a crooked bench outside a shuttered grocery store, sat the woman no one else had seen. Caleb had worked the entire day with grease under his nails and aching arms that still remembered the grip of wrenches, the weight of bolts. He should have been home already. He should have said no when his boss asked him to stay late to fix a toe in. But he needed the extra pay. Needed to keep the lights on, the rent paid, the shoes on his son's feet. Oliver walked beside him, a step behind, his small backpack bumping rhythmically against his back. 7 years old, but already wise to the weariness in his father's shoulders. He didn't complain. He never did. The boy was gentle like his mother, quiet-eyed and tender, the kind of child who noticed birds on wires and faces in clouds. She was hunched forward on the bench, a figure made of creases, coat buttoned wrong, shoes on the wrong feet, a floral scarf wound too tightly around her neck. Her hair, silver and wild, caught the orange glow of a lamp like a halo. "Dad, look," Oliver whispered, tugging lightly at Caleb's sleeve. The old woman's hands trembled in her lap. She muttered something, rocking slowly. Caleb squinted, instincts flaring. His gut always knew when something wasn't right. He crouched to Oliver's level. "Stay here, okay? Right by the post." The boy nodded. Caleb approached her slowly, the way you would a wounded bird. "Ma'am." His voice was low, kind. "Are you all right?" She looked up, eyes a cloudy blue, rimmed in red. Confused, lost, as if his face was both familiar and strange. "I can't find Frank," she whispered. "He was just here. Or maybe I left. Did I leave the kettle on?" Caleb glanced around. No bag, no ID, no one nearby, just a rustle of wind, and a lone dog barking far off. "Are you cold?" he asked. She didn't answer, but shivered slightly. Oliver stepped forward, holding out his water bottle. "You can have this if you're thirsty." She took it with both hands, touched by the gesture more than the water. Her hands looked like paper, thin and veined. She sipped once, then held the bottle like it was something precious. "We should call someone," Caleb said gently. "Maybe the police?" "No police," she whispered, frightened. Frank said no more fuss. Her words scattered like dry leaves. Caleb felt something deep twist in his chest. "All right," he said. "No fuss. Just come warm up. We're not far." She looked up at him like a child, unsure, yet wanting to believe. He held out his hand, and after a long moment, she placed hers in his. It was warm, fragile. They walked home together, man, boy, and forgotten elder, like a broken procession under the quiet stars. The apartment was small, tucked above a garage that didn't belong to him anymore. A flickering hallway light. A heater that clicked before it warmed. But it was clean, lived in. It smelled of tea bags and old lavender detergent. Caleb made a cup of chamomile and offered her a blanket. She held the warm mug with both hands like it was the first good thing she'd touched in days. She stared at the steam rising and said quietly, "I had a girl once. Elise. Smart. Stubborn. I told her not to marry that man." Oliver brought her a photo frame from the side table. "That's my mom," he said. "She's in the sky now." The woman looked at the picture. Her eyes softened. "She's beautiful," she said. "You look like her, sweet pea." The boy beamed. Later, when she had dozed off on the couch, curled up like a cat beneath an old fur blanket, Caleb stared at her hands resting gently against her chest. He didn't know her name, but she looked safe now. The next morning, Caleb called the nearest clinic. They said to bring her in. She might be someone's missing person, might be part of an open case, but they were understaffed. It would take days. So she stayed. She called him Frank twice, and once Marty, but most of the time she just called him dear. At night, she hummed lullabies that sounded like they belonged to another century. Oliver listened from his bed, eyes wide. When she forgot how to finish them, he would make up the rest. "I think she's magic," he told Caleb one night as they brushed their teeth, "like a grandma in stories." Caleb smiled softly. "Maybe she is." He couldn't explain it. The way her presence filled the apartment was something new. Not joy exactly, but depth, like something had rooted. She helped fold laundry, humming softly. Sometimes she'd stop mid-fold and forget where the shirt went. Caleb would gently take it and finish. No scolding, just presence. She tried to sweep once, and Oliver joined her, dancing with the broom like it was a partner. She laughed so hard she cried. Caleb found a box of scarves at the thrift store. She picked out a pale green one, said it matched the curtains in her childhood kitchen. "Where was that?" he asked. She looked at him for a long time. "I don't remember," she said, "but it had lemon trees outside." That night, Caleb bought lemons and sliced them into the water pitcher. Oliver noticed. "For Mimi," he said. Mimi, the name stuck. There was a photo in her coat pocket, worn at the edges. A woman in a business suit beside a much younger version of Mimi, arms wrapped tight, faces cheek to cheek. Elise. Caleb stared at the photo longer than he meant to. The daughter looked tired, powerful, a woman who had climbed mountains but left something behind to do it. Mimi whispered in her sleep that night, "She'll be cold? Tell her to wear the blue coat, the one I gave her." And the next morning, when the clinic said her DNA had a partial match, Caleb felt something strange, like the beginning of goodbye. The first snowfall came quietly. No storm, no warning, just delicate flakes drifting down like blessings. Caleb opened the curtains and found Mimi at the window, smiling. "I remember snow," she said. "We used to make ice pies, just snow in tins, with syrup on top." Oliver begged to try it. So they did. 3 metal pans out on the porch. Drizzles of maple syrup. Laughter. Mimi took a bite and closed her eyes, just like Mama made. Caleb stood at the door, watching them. Snow falling. The child and the elder, 2 at a time, bound by memory and mercy. He didn't know how long she'd stay, or if Elise would come, or if this strange detour in their lives would end with silence or something softer. But for now, the fire was warm, the kettle was singing, and there in the middle of their fragile home sat a woman the world had forgotten, wrapped in a green scarf, sharing ice pies with a child named after the woman Caleb still whispered to in his dreams. And somehow it felt like family. The snow had thickened overnight, softening the world into silence. Roofs wore white coats. Chimneys exhaled gently. And beneath the quiet, the apartment above the old garage stirred with the breath of 3 souls learning how to hold space for each other. Caleb stood by the stove, the steam of oatmeal rising into his face like a memory. His hands, scarred and calloused from years of turning bolts and lifting engines, moved carefully. He stirred slower now, not because he was tired, but because Mimi liked it that way, smooth, without lumps. "Porridge should be a song, not a fight," she had once said, smiling faintly as she watched him from the rocking chair, a woolen shawl around her shoulders like a faded crown. Oliver sat at the kitchen table, legs swinging beneath his chair. He was humming a tune he didn't know the name of, something Mimi had hummed weeks ago while folding dish towels. That's how it was now. Little things passed between them without being spoken. The boy learned the language of gentleness, and Mimi, despite the cracks in her mind, learned to be seen again. Each morning followed a rhythm, like a quiet liturgy. Caleb would rise before dawn. The kettle would whistle. The apartment would warm slowly, beginning with the smell of coffee, the creak of wood, the distant rumble of trucks outside. Sometimes Mimi would wake already seated at the window, staring out at the snow as though watching her past unfold across rooftops. "They don't shovel like they used to," she would mutter. Or, "He used to whistle when he came up the drive, my brother, had a crooked tooth, but a beautiful voice." Caleb never corrected her. He just nodded, refilled her tea, laid an extra pair of socks by the heater for her cold feet. There were letters now, old ones, found in the pocket of a coat Mimi had worn when she arrived. The ink was faded, but the handwriting still held the urgency of youth. One from Elise, scrawled in anger and fear. "You never listened. I needed you, and you vanished into that house of grief. I had no choice but to walk away." Mimi read it aloud one afternoon, her voice thin, trembling. When she finished, she didn't cry. She folded it neatly and set it beside her teacup. "I was cruel," she said softly. Oliver, sitting on the floor with his crayons, looked up. "You're kind now," he whispered. She looked at him then, really looked, and something shifted in her face. A recognition, a remembering. She got up slowly, went to the shelf, and picked up a blue tin box. Inside were buttons, thimbles, old coins. At the very bottom, a small silver bell tied with ribbon. "For you," she said, handing it to him. "I gave one just like this to Elise when she was little. Said would call me when she needed." Oliver held it carefully. "Will it still work?" Mimi smiled. "Only if you believe in grandmas who come back." That night, Caleb stood at the sink washing dishes, hands lost in warm water, when Mimi came and touched his arm. "She'll come," she said. "Elise." Mimi nodded. There's a part of her that still remembers the bell. Caleb didn't answer. He just reached out and gently covered Mimi's hand with his own. It was a quiet moment, but one heavy with grace. Two adults, worn by different regrets, sharing a shelter made of second chances. 1 week later, a knock came on the door. It was slow, hesitant. Oliver had been painting, his hands covered in smudges of green and gold. Caleb wiped them quickly with a dish towel, then opened the door. A woman stood there, face lined with years and tension, a scarf tucked into her coat. In her hands, a photo, the one Caleb had mailed weeks ago, with Mimi's faded handwriting on the back. "Still here, still waiting." "Elise," Caleb said, barely above a whisper. She nodded. Her eyes scanned the small apartment, landed on the rocking chair, the teacup, the old scarf hanging on a hook. Then Mimi's voice from the hallway. "Is it the mail again, dear?" Elise stepped inside. Her breath caught. "Mama?" Mimi turned the corner, eyes clouded but wide. She tilted her head, took a small step closer. "You wore the blue coat," she said, reaching out. Elise's lip trembled. She dropped her bag, took 2 more steps, and then they were holding each other, like two halves of memory finally reunited. "I didn't forget you," Elise whispered into her mother's shoulder. "And I never stopped believing you'd remember the bell." Oliver watched from behind Caleb's leg, holding the silver bell tight in his palm. That night, the fire in the old heater glowed golden. The apartment felt too small for the warmth it now held. They ate simple soup, bread warmed in the oven. No one said much, but Elisa's hand stayed on her mother's, gently tracing the veins. Later, after Mimi fell asleep on the couch, Elise sat at the table, staring into her tea. "I blamed her for everything," she said, "but grief had hollowed her out, and I didn't know how to love the shell that was left." Caleb nodded slowly. "Sometimes the shell's all we have left, but it still echoes." Elise looked at him, her eyes soft. "You took her in." "She took us in," he said. "We were empty too." She smiled just a little. "Thank you." He didn't say you're welcome. Just glanced toward Oliver, asleep under a quilt on the floor, bell still clutched in one small hand. Outside, the snow had stopped. Stars blinked over the quiet street. And inside, in the warm hush of found family and softened regrets, 3 generations breathe the same air again. Not perfectly, not forever, but for now, together. Wind brushed the window panes like an old friend passing by, the kind that leaves a coat of memory behind. Snow fell again that morning, thick and unhurried, cloaking the world in hush. Inside the apartment above the garage, time slowed to match its rhythm. The kettle began its gentle song. Caleb, older now on the edges of his hair and the weight behind his eyes, moved like the house itself. Quiet, creaking, dependable. He stirred a second cup without thinking. One for him, one for Elise. She'd started coming by most mornings now. Not out of guilt, not obligation. Just rhythm. Mimi didn't always wake early anymore. Some days she lingered in dreams, calling softly for people long gone. Other days, her eyes opened wide in full lucidity, the kind that felt like a borrowed hour from a fading lantern. Today was a good one. She sat bundled in 2 cardigans by the window, a quilt tucked around her lap, watching Oliver play on the carpet. He was taller, and quieter too, but not in a way that felt small. More like he'd learned the sacredness of silence. Every now and then, he'd look up from his drawings and hand Mimi a picture, a house with 3 chimneys, a hand holding another hand, a bell. She hung each one by the window, like stained glass made from crayon and hope. Elise arrived just after sunrise, snow in her eyelashes and her hair tucked beneath a knitted hat her mother had once made. "You left your scarf last night," she said, placing it gently on the table. Caleb gave a small smile. "I was wondering why the cold felt personal." She laughed softly, just enough, and like always, she poured herself a cup of tea without asking, sat in the same chair, folded her hands like a ritual. They didn't need to fill the space with chatter. Something better had replaced the need for words. The sound of Mimi humming, the crackle of heat pipes, the turning of a page as Oliver read softly to himself. Later, Mimi nodded off her chair. Elise covered her with the quilt more snugly, brushed a strand of white hair from her mother's cheek. "She called me Elise yesterday," she said. Caleb looked up. "She hasn't done that since I was 17. Not like that. Not with her eyes knowing who I am." He said nothing, just passed her the photo album. It was one of Mimi's rituals, though she forgot most names inside it now. Elise had started writing little notes under each photo. Names, dates, a memory if one still existed. "Here," she said, pointing to a photo of a picnic in faded sepia tones. "This was the summer she taught me to sew. I cried because I couldn't make the hem straight. She made us lemonade and said, 'Even crooked stitches hold things together.'" Caleb stared at the photo, then at Elise. She was right. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds in slivers. It touched the window, casting golden lines across the floor where Oliver lay napping with his cheek pressed against a pillow sewn by Mimi's trembling hands. That afternoon, Caleb took them to the town's old market. Mimi stayed home, resting, her hand loosely clutching a worn letter from years ago, the one Elise had once written in anger. She held it now as something sacred, a relic of pain that had finally been answered. At the market, Elise lingered by a stand of baby clothes, her eyes quiet. "I dream sometimes," she whispered, "of another life, one where I never left, one where Dad didn't pass so fast, one where she didn't fall so far into the dark." Caleb didn't offer what-ifs. He just placed a hand on her shoulder. "This one's not perfect," he said, "but maybe it's still a good one." On the way back, Oliver spotted an old music box in a thrift store window, the kind with a winding key and a ballerina that spun too slowly. "I want to give it to Mimi," he said, "for when she forgets the songs." They bought it with coins from Caleb's glove box and a few crumpled bills Elise found in her pocket. That night, after dinner, Oliver sat beside Mimi's chair. She watched the dancer spin, listened to the broken lullaby. Then, With trembling fingers, she reached for the bell beside her teacup and rang it, softly. "Still works," she said. They all looked at her. She smiled clear-eyed. "You all came back." It was such a small sentence, but it held years in its echo. Later, after the dishes were done and Oliver had been tucked into bed with a story, Elise stood by the doorway. "I used to think grace was something you earned," she said, voice barely above the whisper of wind outside. Caleb looked up from drying a pan. "It's not." She shook her head slowly. "It's what comes when you finally stop running and sit long enough to let the pain find its place." He nodded, then reached into the drawer, pulled out a note. "Found this in Mimi's sewing box," he said. It was a small slip of paper, yellowed, folded 100 times. "If you ever come back, I'll know it was love." Elise stared at it. Her eyes welled, but she didn't cry. She just folded the paper back up, held it to her heart. "Then here I am." The snow had stopped. Outside, stars blinked through the thawing clouds. Inside, a grandmother slept with peace on her face. A boy dreamed of ballerinas and silver bells. A daughter held a letter like a prayer. And a man, once lonely, washed dishes as if each plate was a gesture of thanksgiving. Grace had found its way back, and stayed. The wind was softer now, not gone, just gentler, like it knew spring was near, but wasn't quite ready to say goodbye to winter's hush. The old bell on Mimi's porch gave a little clang as Caleb fastened it with new twine. A soft sound, the kind that echoed more in memory than in air. He stepped back, looked at it, and smiled. It wasn't much, but it still meant home. Inside, the house was full of quiet preparation. Not busy, not frantic, just that slow kind of movement that happens when people are getting ready for something new and good. Elise stood in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, hands deep in dough, the same way her mother used to do when Sundays still meant fresh bread and a house full of voices. Oliver was at the table beside her, shaping rolls that looked nothing like rolls. But she didn't correct him, just smiled and dusted flour across his nose like a blessing. "Think Mimi will like them?" he asked. Elise paused, then nodded. "She'll love them, even if they're a little lopsided." He grinned. Upstairs, Mimi was awake. Not always lucid, not always present, but awake. She sat by the window that faced the woods. In her lap was the same old letter, folded, smoothed, read so many times now the words might as well have been etched in her hands. Caleb stepped into the room, careful not to startle. "You warm enough?" She nodded, slow. "I dreamed of bells," she murmured. He sat in the chair beside her. "They used to ring when Elise ran down the path after school," she continued, eyes unfocused but soft. "Every time I heard them, I knew she was still mine." A silence passed between them. Then she looked at him. "You fixed it." "I did." Her fingers found his, knotted with age and effort. "You're a good man, Caleb." He blinked slowly. He'd heard those words before, but this time they stayed. Later, as the afternoon light stretched long across the floorboards, guests began to arrive. Not many, just a handful of neighbors. Mrs. Alder with her cane and basket of crocheted booties. Jack from the hardware store. A few faces who remembered Elise from when she was still a girl with scraped knees and big questions. They came to bless the new beginning, to witness the quiet turning of a page. Because that morning, the papers had arrived, signed and sealed. The deed now in Elise's name. The garage shop, too. And the home, what Mimi once feared would be lost, had instead become legacy. In the living room, Mimi sat in her armchair, wrapped in her shawl, watching the light flicker off teacups and memories. Elise knelt beside her, holding her hand. "We'll take care of it, Mama," she whispered. "All of it. You rest now." Mimi looked at her, eyes glassy but steady. "You already are." Oliver stood near the hearth, holding a drawing. He hadn't shown it to anyone yet. When the chatter softened and the tea had cooled, He walked over to Mimi and unfolded the paper. It was their house, but drawn as if it had roots. Branches grew from its roof. Birds perched on the bell, and below it, in careful letters, "Home is who stays." Mimi took the drawing, traced the lines with her fingertip. Then, with a breath soft as dusk, she whispered, "You're a good boy." Caleb turned toward the window, eyes damp. Later, the stars returned. Elise and Caleb sat on the porch steps, shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in one blanket. The bell swayed gently above them. "You ever think," she asked, "that maybe we don't find home, it finds us?" He nodded. "Only after we stop running." She looked at him, and this time she didn't look away. From the upstairs window, Mimi watched them. She couldn't hear their words, but she didn't need to. She closed her eyes, and in that stillness, let go of years she had held too tightly. Inside, the music box played again. Oliver wound it before bed now, said it helped Mimi sleep. The ballerina still twirled, slow, uneven, but constant, and in a drawer by her bedside, Elise tucked away the letter. The one Mimi wrote long ago, the one that said, "If the house forgets our laughter, bring it back. If the bell goes silent, ring it. If I forget who you are, remind me with love." She had. They all had. And now, the house remembered. If this story touched you, subscribe or share where you're watching from. These stories matter.